and the strategy planning meeting for the next 1 year. We are also, as a continuum to this program, we are having a very important 3-day international workshop happening here, which will be looking into one of the most important contribution by Kerala and to the world in a closer lens, looking into the whole idea of decentralization and the decentralized democracy in the context of whatever happening all over the world. So, let me welcome Sri Gopal Krishna Gandhi and Sri Madhav Menon and Advocate Prashant Bhushan and Sri Wajahat Abibullah. We have other great dignitaries right from various parts of the country and from Bhutan are here, and we have a special guest from Canada, and John Harris and others here. And also let me especially welcome our Honorable Chief Secretary Sri Vijayanand sir, the Director of Tata Institute Professor S. Parashuraman, the Chief Information Commissioner of Kerala Sri Vincent Paul, and all of this. Today also we are honoring Dr. K.M. Abraham for his relentless work in fighting against corruption. And Dr. K.M. Abraham and Mrs. Abraham are here. I am especially welcoming both of them. Let me also welcome all the dignitaries and the representatives and delegates from various parts of the country, and also the tribal representatives from various parts of the country, and also from Attapadi in Kerala. Also we have people right from Kasaragod to Trivandrum, from various districts who are working in the RTA movement. They are also here. I am welcoming all of you here for the let me now invite Cheryl to read out the introduction to the dignitaries for this program. Thank you. So we'll begin with honoring Sri Dr. K.M. Abraham, and I will request Cheryl to read out the citation.
So as we move into this special part of today's program, we want to today honor the courage and commitment of an exemplary civil servant, Dr. K.M. Abraham, currently Additional Chief Secretary Finance, Government of Kerala. He has been a whistleblower who has striven despite all odds to unravel corruption and continues to be a committed and dedicated official. Sir, I welcome you. To present him with this citation, I would like to welcome Mr. Prashant Bhushan, Public Advocate at the Supreme Court. Mr. Bhushan is the convener of the Campaign for Judicial Accountability and Reforms and has been a leading voice on issues of accountability and transparency in the government and judiciary.
Before I read the citation, I must tell you that though I'm meeting Dr. Abraham for the first time today, I am very familiar with his work. I am familiar because I have dealt with some of his whistleblowing in the Supreme Court in several cases in the Supreme Court where we have used the notings, the letters, and the various orders passed by Mr. Abraham when he was a whole-time member of SEBI on many things. As you all know, the importance of whistleblowers across the world and the importance of having whistleblowers in every society is being recognized more and more across the world. More and more countries have passed laws and regulations to encourage whistleblowers to blow the whistle about corruption and wrongdoing in their respective departments. Laws have been passed to put in place institutions to protect whistleblowers, institutions to take up complaints of whistleblowers, etc. Unfortunately, in India, though we have an act, a Whistleblower Act, it has not been notified, it has not been brought into law. And currently we have an unfortunately weak institution called the Central Vigilance Commission to enforce the administrative notification that was issued by the government regarding whistleblower protection. So it is indeed a great honor and a great pleasure for me to read this citation for Dr. Abraham. Dr. K.M. Abraham is an exemplary civil servant. Throughout his career, he has demonstrated a very high degree of integrity, honesty, and professional excellence. He has functioned as a vigilant custodian of public resources, taking strong positions against corruption, in which the most powerful and influential have been involved. He has striven to unravel corruption that is often masked by legal and procedural loopholes. As a whistleblower against corruption, he has illustrated the role of an upright bureaucracy in safeguarding principles of democracy, transparency, and accountability. He remains a role model for his peers and younger colleagues in the administration. His fight against corruption has reaffirmed the faith of society at large and civil society groups in particular in a bureaucracy that is honest and upright. I have great pleasure and honor in giving him this citation.
Distinguished dignitaries on the dais and friends who have gathered here. Sometimes I have felt that the struggle has been very dreary and hard. The journey has been rather long, and sometimes you almost feel like choking with exasperation that institutions and people who are supposed to deliver justice just don't do that. But at the end of all that, I can stand here and get an award from a committee that consists of some of the best men and women born in my generation. I think that is the best reward I can get. That is the best recompense I can get. Thank you very much. Thank you for making this possible. I am grateful to all of you for bestowing this honor. Thank you.
Now, we are going to release a very important book about the status of RTA in the country. And before that, I am going to invite Amrita and Anjali Bharadwaj to introduce this book to you. Introduce this book to you. Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Gandhi for agreeing to release this report. It's a collective effort. Since the morning, we've been talking about how the right to information law, since it's been passed 11 years ago, has been used by people across the country to hold the government accountable. And it's not just been used by people to question the high offices, it's been used by the common people of the country to get information about their basic rights and entitlements like rations, like pensions. And it's been truly one of the most empowering legislations for the common people. But this has also meant that there has been a huge backlash that the RTI has often faced. And one of the things that we have noticed in the last 11 years is that there has been a consistent effort at myth building, myth creation. So from time to time, we hear the Prime Minister, various ministers talk about how the Right to Information Act is being misused, how frivolous and vexatious RTI applications are filed, how government's time is wasted on catering to RTI applications. As a movement, collectively, we felt, therefore, that it's important for people and people involved in the Right to Information movement to constantly monitor the implementation of the Right to Information law and to also gather evidence so that we could counter some of these myths. It's an effort in that direction that we all have been working and undertaking people's assessments to monitor the implementation of the RTI law. There have been 2 previous reports, and what the reports really showed to us was that one of the most important bottlenecks in the implementation of the law today in the country is the performance of the adjudicators, especially the information commissions in the country. This study, this report, is essentially a report which examines the performance of the adjudicators, the information commissions, the Central Information Commission and State Information Commissions, and it also looks at the various orders passed by the Supreme Court on the Right to Information law since it was passed and by high courts. So we've looked at 30 Supreme Court orders, 400 High Court orders, and over 2,000 Information Commission orders which were passed by different information commissions in the country. We found that a huge problem in the Information Commission's functioning is that there is a lot of pending cases in each of the commissions, primarily due to lack of appointments being made promptly in these commissions. So we have states like Assam where there is a 30-year pendency, in West Bengal where there is an 11-year wait. If somebody files an RTI appeal or complaint to the commission, they would have to wait for 11 years in West Bengal and 30 years in Assam, and in Kerala 7 years, unfortunately, is what the study has shown us. In terms of penalty imposition, the information commissions have again been found to be, the orders have been problematic. 59% of the orders we found when we analyzed recorded penalizable offences, but only 1.3% of the cases were penalty actually imposed. So it sends a signal that violation of the law is easily tolerated. And finally, the quality of orders of the commissions have also been a matter of great concern. We found that close to 60% of the orders that we analyzed, which were randomly selected, were not speaking orders. They did not record even the basic information which related to the case. These are all statistics which mean very little to us unless we use it in the movement. And groups across the country, part of the Right to Information movement, are using these, and we hope to use these much more to bring about positive change. The study also looks at the Supreme Court and High Court orders, some of the good orders which have been passed both by the Supreme Court and High Court, and some of the orders which offer very restrictive interpretation of the law and therefore really restrict its ambit. We hope that it will generate a public debate so that in future some of these orders are better delivered. Thank you so much. And
can we ask Mr. Gandhi to please release the report and our RTI from the red tape that sometimes it gets caught up in? Thank you.
I'll request Arunaji to come and introduce another very important book of Teesta.
Today, we've all come here together to think of Justice Krishna Iyer. Today, we are also here to think of justice and to think of people who struggle against tremendous odds. So Justice Krishna Iyer, for me, has been synonymous with a voice raised for justice, for equality, despite the most severe odds. It's only appropriate that today we talk about Teesta Setalwar and the book she's written called Foot Soldier of the Constitution, because it's when she set up the Concerned Citizens Tribunal to look into the carnage in Gujarat that I really got to know Justice Krishna Iyer because he was a chair of that committee. I'm not going to tell you about what that report said. It's up on the web. Anybody who wants to see it can look at it. But today, I bring this book to you. There are copies lying outside for sale. Teesta is not able to come, but for both the memory of Justice Krishna Iyer and to stand in solidarity with Justice Sawant, who drafted the Right to Information law and who has a caption at the back for Teesta, and Romila Thapar and all those in India for fighting for the rights of people and who feel that the right to freedom of expression is the most fundamental of all expressions, and people like Teesta are being vilified for speaking for those who have no voice. I have great happiness and I consider it a great honor and privilege that today here, looking at Krishna Iyer's photograph, I request Gopal Gandhi, my friend, to please hand over a copy each to all members on the dais in memory of Gandhiji, who in all his battles fought for justice, even if it was somehow at that point people didn't understand him or disagreed with him for what he thought was right. So thinking of the lovely songs that were sung in his honor this evening, and also of Aklo Chalo Re, the famous song that Rabindranath Tagore wrote for him, that even if the world turned aside, if you felt it was right, so when he went on the Dandi March and he sang Aklo Chalo Re, it's also ironical, that, or maybe not so ironical, that Teesta fought her primary battles in the land of Gandhi in Gujarat. So I'm going to request Gopu to please hand over a copy of this book to all of us on stage, and I request you to give a big hand for Teesta.
The second Justice Krishna Iyer Memorial Lecture is organized by the Campaign for Judicial Accountability and Reforms, along with the National Campaign for People's Right to Information, Common Cause, and the RTI movement in Kerala. This lecture will be delivered by Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi. Before I invite Mr. Wajahat Habibullah to introduce and welcome Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, I would like to introduce Mr. Wajahat Habibullah again, as well as the panelists for the discussion that will follow this lecture. Mr. Wajahat Habibullah is a former civil servant from the Indian Administrative Services. After retiring from the service, Mr. Habibullah served as India's first Chief Information Commissioner, heading the final Court of Appeal under the Right to Information Act. He was also the chairman of the National Commission for Minorities. Welcome, sir. Dr. Madhav Menon is known as one of the long-serving popular legal educators of the country an institution builder, the architect of the 5-year integrated LLB program, and founder vice-chancellor of 2 of the leading law universities of India. He has endeavored for nearly 5 decades to put Indian legal education at par with the best. He was the founding director of the National Judicial Academy, and recognizing his excellence and contribution, he was the first law professor in India to be conferred with the Padma Shri Award. Welcome, sir. Ms. Aruna Roy is a social activist and founding member of the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan. She was in the Indian Administrative Services from 1968 to 1975 and resigned her work in order to work with people's issues. She is a prominent member of many campaigns, including the NCPRI, Pension Parithrad, PUCL, NAPM, etc., and is a leading voice on issues of transparency and accountability in the government. She and the NKSS have been recipients of many awards, including the Raman Magsaysay Award for Community Leadership and the prestigious Lal Bahadur Shastri National Award for Excellence in Public Administration, Academia and Management. Welcome. Prashant Bhushan is a human rights activist and public interest advocate practicing at the High Court and the Supreme Court of India. He is noted for his use of public interest litigation to support a number of causes related to the fight against corruption in high places and government accountability, environmental protection, displacement and rehabilitation, and the human rights of the poor and downtrodden. He has been actively involved in the Right to Information campaign, the campaign against destructive development, the campaign against corruption in general, and in particular, judicial corruption. He is the convener of the Campaign for Judicial Accountability and Reforms. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is not only an honor, but a deep pleasure for me to come and speak to you to introduce Mr. Gopal Krishnan Gandhi. It is somewhat ironic, in fact, that this day when we are celebrating the openness of information and the basis of democratic governance, 3 of the persons sitting side by side are former colleagues from the IAS, the first line of defense of government from too many inquiries by the public. Not only that, we also belong to the same batch of the IAS, which was the 1968 batch. I'm surprised that our batchmates haven't quite labelled us as renegades or so forth, but we haven't been quite so labelled. Mr. Gopal Krishnan Gandhi and I go back even further. We were at the same college, which was St. Stephen's College in Delhi, which of course he had an old family connection with. And we studied there together, qualified for the IAS together. He was of course in the Tamil Nadu cadre, and I was at the other end of India, Jammu and Kashmir cadre. But we remained in touch and met occasionally, but remained firm and very good friends. And as you know, Gopal Krishnan Gandhi went on to become Secretary to the Vice President, Secretary to the President, Ambassador to South Africa, and has distinguished himself in so many ways, and finally, of course, Governor of West Bengal, where he was housed, again ironically, in a Raj Bhavan, which was formerly the home of the Governor General, a Governor General whom his grandfather stoutly opposed. And again, it is my privilege to share with you the information that while he resided in this house, made famous by the residence of Governors General and Viceroys of the British Empire, into that palace of the Viceroys, which were responsible, and of Canning, who was responsible for the defeat of our first war of independence, he has put in a portrait of the leader, of our leader, of the First War of Independence, Bahadur Shah Zafar. So, this is Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi. I don't, of course, have to tell you that he belongs to the most distinguished family in the country. He's a grandson of Mahatma Gandhi from his father's side, and a grandson of Rajaji from his mother's side. So he is in fact a combination of North India and South India, and a very fitting person to come today to deliver this talk of the second Justice Krishna Iyer Memorial Lecture, Who Rules India? To panchayats, the government, the judiciary, or NOTA. As you know, Panchayati Raj was a pet project of his grandfather and is now real, but is it coming up to those levels? Has it become the real ruler of this country? We're looking forward to hearing from Raj Mohan and from Gopal. Raj Mohan is his brother, so you can understand from Gopal Krishna Gandhi what his views are on this subject. Thank you, Jay.
Sri Gopal Krishna Gandhi.
Thank you very much, Wajahat, for those generous, kind words of introduction. I must supplement what Mr. Habibullah has said by adding a few honest but somewhat mischievous consequential comments. The first is, yet we are all from the same batch of the IAS, but Aruna resigned from the IAS and took a plunge into all the risks of non-governmental activity, forsaking everything that goes with the security of the IAS. Wajahat completed a whole span of distinguished service in the IAS, facing the most unbelievable hazards, personal and professional. I took voluntary retirement after ensuring that my pension was properly protected. And as to my being descended from two great individuals, that can only be called a double accident of birth, to which not only does no credit attach to me, but which makes me particularly susceptible to a whole spate of RTIs on how I have used my surname to further my own interest. Friends, it is a great privilege to be on the dais with Srimati Aruna Roy, Shri Wajahat Habibullah, the esteemed Shri Madhav Menon, and the Honorable Shri Prashant Bhushan, and to be speaking to all of you on the occasion when we commemorate the memory, the legacy, the challenge posed to us by Justice B.R. Krishna Iyer. Justice Krishna Iyer was, in one word, incredible. For a Brahmin with an urban upbringing to become a lawyer and then to become a judge was not unusual. And he became that. But the route that he took to that position via a radical politics as an MLA and a minister, pioneering landmark legislation, was more than unusual. It was exceptional. And then, having given radical judgments, memorable as much for their judicial originality as much as for their linguistic and literary unusualness, for him to become an amazingly active public intellectual and a conscience keeper to the nation was again extraordinary. he was not the traditional twice born, but a multiple avatar. But what was even more extraordinary, and the most extraordinary thing about him, than all those great transitions in his life, was the running thread through all those incarnations of a passion for justice, for equity, and for fairness, and for what may be called simple, plain human decency. His peers and other colleagues and contemporaries were astonished to see that his multiple identities not only were an introduction to his great personality, but also served a public purpose. And what was that purpose? Justice Krishna Iyer's multiple identities showed what a multiplicity India herself is in her varied aspects, facets, dimensions, and what a multiplicity of being and belonging every Indian is. Every Indian, every individual in this audience, for instance, is. The very name Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer says, or rather it proclaims this, that India is diverse, heterogeneous, plural, and all the diversities that it has are not just one fixed mural, but are in themselves evolving and becoming more diverse within that diversities, becoming impossible for anyone to homogenize, to monochromize, and to monopolize the great diversity and plurality that is India. So what rules India? Some of you may be expecting to give a name, so and so rules India. That would be too pat an answer, either today or at any other time. India is an anthropological work in progress. Bharat is a sociological opus of which we have just about seen the first volume. And Hindustan is that, to borrow a phrase or a word from Iqbal, Hindustan is that Gulistan of which the flowers yet to bloom outnumber the myriad varieties that we know. And so who can possibly rule this India? And yet, there are those who believe that this India can be brought under the thumb of a kind of rule, of a kind of domination, either of an ideology or of a certain vision for India, a certain sense of India, or of a certain party, or of a certain person. There are those who would like our constant variety to get frozen and cast in one particular kind of stone, using one particular kind of language, one script, one predominant identity being its message, one dominant language, one mega book, one overarching mountain, one mother river. To go back to Sare Jahan Se Acha, it has these words which do not need a translation anywhere, be it Srinagar or Srirangam, Tirunandapuram or Guwahati. Godi mein khelti hain jiski hazaron nadiyan. And yet there is a move that all these hazaron nadiyans should be integrated river, which probably will be called the Ek Ganga or the Amara Ganga. Totally untenable, either in terms of hydrology or in terms of life. Now, lest somebody imagine that I am targeting one particular culture of the many cultures of India. Let me say emphatically that if Pakistan or Bangladesh were to make their populations speak only one language, profess only one religion, read only the Holy Quran, and sing only their national anthem, that would be equally ludicrous, equally untenable, and equally retrograde. A great Sri Lankan, a great communist, Colvin Silva, said to those who were advocating the Sinhala-only policy in Sri Lanka, Colvin Silva said to them, one language, two countries. Two languages, one country. Diversity, even for that so-called small nation, is the hallmark of civilization. Monoculturalism cannot work in India, nor its cousin, majoritarianism. But they can work havoc in society, and they are doing so already. Monopolies are wrong in themselves. It is not a question of this monopoly or that monopoly. Cults are wrong in themselves. It is not a question of this cult or that cult. Try making Shakespeare compulsory. Try making Hamlet compulsory reading. You would all want it not to be. Try making Kalidas compulsory. You would all want to become Dushyanta, forgetting Shakuntala. Try, for that matter, making Tagore or Gandhi mandatory. I would much rather take to crosswords and Sudoku than read any text, howsoever great, under an order or under a fiat. I love our national anthem. It is probably among the greatest anthems in the world. And I will sing it to myself. I will sing it with full heart. But to be asked to sing it under an order is to make a passionate hymn, a humdrum chant of official value. India is about variety, it is also about choices. An India denied choice is an India that denies itself. And yet, we have to have an organization to run our country. We need a government. Nation states come in, forms of government come in, systems of statehood come in, for reasons of holding a nation state together. But ruling India, however, is not just about forming or leading governments, forming or leading political parties. Ruling India is, in fact, is definitionally impossible. Strength is one thing, power is another. Strength has stature, power has status. Strength is about an inherent scheme of energies. Power is about an externally imposed infrastructure of obedience systems. Ruling India was attempted at a higher level where strength, not power, was invoked by a great Indian. He did not call himself that because the name did not exist then. I am referring to Ashoka. It is extraordinary how he planted his message of remorse and atonement, not of power and prestige. Though he was king enough to say, Ashoka himself is Devanama Priya Priyadasi. He did give himself that honorable, hyperbolic title. But the message that he contained was not about ruling, but about impacting, about influencing the mind of India. And the messages were implanted from Kandahar to Kalinga, from Bihar to Karnataka, outlining the territories of his empire in what is now India. And before him, the Buddha, without a sense of Indianness, had a message to give to the people he regarded as the people of this landmass. And from this part of the country, Adi Shankara, setting up his dhammas, gave India a sense of its identity. But they were all about influencing the mind of India. But there have been others who followed in their wake, who did the same thing in a different way. Akbar's Deen-e-Ilahi was a message that contained in it the acknowledgement of the varieties of India. Akbar was not contesting an election. He was not interested in getting Jai Jaikars from his populace. He certainly was a strategist who wanted to impact on the collectivity of the people of India by giving a picture of India's compositeness and a theological pathway to concretizing that collectivity. 3 generations down, Dara Shikoh tried to do something similar in the book which he called The Commingling of Religious Thought. Why should Dara Shikoh have tried to translate or get translated under his aegis the Upanishads? He was not lining up for a Sahitya Academy Award. He was doing something because he believed that India is not to be ruled, but India is to be held. India is to be held together by people who want to see its collectivity, which is very different from being one homogeneous entity. India being told to be uniform is antithetical to the genius of India, which is multiple. Who rules India? I will take no more than 10 to 15 minutes to what I am saying. I said I will not mention the name of a person. I will not. I need not. I have said who. I should say what. Fear rules India. But fear has met its most severe challenges also in India. I do not think there can be a personification of fearlessness other than Aruna Roy. We have tremendously fearless people in our country. What Prashant Bhushan has done, what Wajahat has done as India's first CIC, what the beacon of courage Nayantara Sehgal is doing, what Teesta Setalwal has done, what the team that went to Kashmir with Wajahat Habibullah and Yashwant Sinha and Sushobha and Mr. Kark and Bharat Bhushan, what they have done is a gleaming example of fearlessness, not just in the risks that they took in Kashmir, but in the courage with which they faced the reality of Kashmir and made the suggestions which they have made in their report. But the fact is that overall in India, fear is abroad. And I was told recently when I said this, if fear is a fact, how are you speaking? If there is so much fear in the country, how do you write like you write? Now, it did not occur to me then to say this. It occurred to me a little later that I should have said this. In Delhi, the suspended particulate matters which make up the pollution in Delhi is a fact. If somebody is told, why do you complain of pollution? You are breathing. Why do you complain of pollution? You can wear a mask. Why do you complain of pollution? You can ride in an air-conditioned car. You have an air-conditioned house. Why are you complaining? That does not mean that there is no pollution. Pollution is a fact. It should not be there. It is not only a fact, it is a fatal flaw, as fear is. How does fear manifest itself? Let me very quickly tell you how it is manifesting itself, say, in the legislative wing of our country, in the legislatures, the pillar of our state, the most glowing and prominent pillar of our state. It is the fear of facing the truth. Why is the Lokpal still dangling in mid-air? Is it just because of dotting the I's and crossing the T's that is required, and that is why it is not falling in place? It is not this government alone, but successive governments for not one term, 2 terms, continuously for a countless, or not countless, but a rather difficult to count number of years, that the Lokpal has not become a reality. It is something which the legislature should do. Why is the Whistleblowing Act, the Whistleblowers Protection Act, not yet notified? And can there be any reason? Legislature. And then, as Gandhi said, those who come to seek justice must come with clean hands. So let us grant, let us acknowledge all that the legislatures of India have also done, quite fearlessly. Abolition of untouchability itself was a legislative achievement. The abolition of dowry was a legislative achievement. Though it came after much heated debates, it took a joint session, but still it was passed. The RTI Act itself is a legislative act. It's a legislative accomplishment. But the fact is, nonetheless, like the pollution in Delhi, there is a kind of fear to face reality in our legislatures. Not just Parliament, but in our state legislatures as well. There is fear there. How about our executive, cabinet, officials, bureaucracy? Barring the prime ministerships of Jawaharlal Nehru and Lal Bahadur Shastri, and subsequently a few scattered exceptions, our cabinets have looked upon the Prime Minister of the day as a kind of alpha and omega, the Indus and the Ganga of everything. When Nehru was Prime Minister, he had distinguished members of his cabinet who would disagree with him in the cabinet and be known to have disagreed with him. Today that is not so. The randomization of ministers is matched only by the digitization of the bureaucracy and the robotization of the diplomats. Fear rules the executive machine. Gone are the days when ambassadors used to send dispatches saying this should be done and that should be done, this should not be done, that should not be done. Today they are waiting for South Bloc to tell them what they should say. And then again say it not in detailed reports, but in one-liner, two-liner messages sent not in good English or better Hindi, but in Linux and C and C++ and Java. Of collectors, you will still find extraordinary examples of initiative and guts. But by and large, the time when district officials and those in the civil services architecture in the state capital, were when they were powerful persons who were heard with respect, has been replaced by predictability, standardization, basically uniformity. I must, before a gathering which has legal luminaries present, be extremely careful before I say anything regarding the judiciary. I would like to start by saying that we have had some extraordinarily brave and independent orders coming from our courts. I would like particularly to mention the order on in the Nandini Sundar versus the state of Chhattisgarh. It's an extraordinary judgment. Similarly, you will understand and forgive me, I took a couple of notes on this. In the Shreya Singhal case on the Information Technology Act, striking down section 66A. In the Nalsa versus the Union of India regarding the rights of transgenders. In the famous Novartis case when a cancer drug's patent was scrapped by the Supreme Court. These were judgments against not just persons or parties concerned, but against powerful lobbies, which showed that they were fearless, that the courts were fearless. But the miasma of fear does not stop at the doors of the judiciary. It sometimes can seep through those doors as well. What is the risk that fear poses in the judiciary? It is, of course, the risk from an irritated government. But there is another risk which the judiciary must face, and that is the risk of succumbing to the fear of public opinion. It has not succumbed too many times to that fear. But public opinion being voiced by majoritarianism, drummed up with covert and overt official backing, can be daunting even to the most independent of courts. I am confident that the judiciary will not succumb to that, because the judiciary is really a panacea today. It is a great avenue for all those who value fearlessness. Friends, as I round off, I want to talk of two more rulers of India. One is fear. The other is distrust. Distrust is a common human failing, rather pronounced on the subcontinent of Asia, but much more pronounced in India, even more pronounced in political India, and extremely active in today's politics. Distrust leads to the supersession of honest persons, be they officers, diplomats, judges, or generals. Judges are not superseded now. They were in Mrs. Gandhi's time. Today the system is different. Judges can't be superseded. But the recommendations for the appointments to judicial positions can be stalled by governments, and they have been stalled by governments. Why? Distrust. Distrust of what? That the person will not be honest, will not be independent? No. Distrust of the opposite. That they may be too independent, they may be too honest, may be a problem for us. And finally, not because it is the most important, but because it is the most pervasive, even more than fear, is the final ruler of India, which is money. Money rules India. I am sorry to have to say this. In a state which has said, get lost to money, in which corporate India has had to take a back seat, but money rules. And I have the final task, shall I say, final duty, to share with you the fact that demonetization or no demonetization, the immobilization of 1,000 rupee notes or 500 rupees or no immobilization, the arresting of 86% of our cash or no arresting of 86%. The fact is, as revealed by the organization which has gone into democratic accountability, that 11.4 thousand crores were received by 6 national parties and 51 recognized parties in the period 2004 to 2014 or 2005 to 2015, of which a very small amount came from known donors. The largest chunk of it, 8,000 crores, came from unknown sources, from people who have taken advantage of the Income Tax Act's provision that those who give up to 20,000 do not have to have their names revealed. So several unknown donors have donated 20,000, and they are not simple people donating 20,000 out of their savings. They are all big-time donors, representatives. 8,000 crores have been donated to our national parties by people whose names those parties will not tell us. The RTI Act is to be made applicable to political parties. They are resisting. But it is time that we ask, after all, this is a democracy. Parties are in the public space. Where has this money come from? A government's intention to whiten the cash composition of our country can only be considered genuine if that government, starting with the party that is in power, namely itself, makes it obligatory for parties to disclose the identities of their donors and thereby make money, not India's ruler, but India's servant, playing the purpose that money is meant to play. I shall take your leave, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that home to status quo that India is also an open university of change. Jungle of lawlessness that it is, India is also a grove of good laws. A well of ignorance that it is also a fount of knowledge, a temple of customs and conservatism that it is also a public square of open rebellion from which the RTI Act was born. We need not despair of India, but we cannot rest on our oars. Justice Krishna Iyer would want nothing more from us, but nothing less either.